Hello everyone. On this day, July 7th of 2020, I would like to celebrate the birthday of one of my favorite composers, Gustav Mahler. He would have turned 160 years old today. And so to celebrate his birthday, I would like to speak a little bit about arguably one of the most influential of his works, the Ninth Symphony. I had the pleasure of studying this piece for one of my final exams at UCLA, and so I discovered quite a bit about this work. Obviously, one of those discoveries was the fact that I know very little about it, so all of these are just sort of like a superficial approach, but I hope it's, if anything, that it helps you to become more interested in it, and that so that you can also do some research about it and learn more about it, and thus enrich your life by listening to it. So here is a little bit about Mahler's Ninth Symphony. So this symphony was written between the years 1908 and 1909, and it is in fact Mahler's last finished symphony. He started writing the 10th, but unfortunately he passed away before finishing that piece. And actually another sort of sad fact is that he never got to listen to a performance of the Ninth Symphony. He died in 1911, a year prior to the premiere of the Ninth Symphony in 1912. So this symphony has been famously quoted as his true farewell symphony. And Leonard Bernstein famously named each of the four movements as a different kind of farewell. The first one being a farewell to sort of childhood innocence. The second movement being a farewell to country life, which Mahler loved so much and where he composed much of his music in his summer retreats in the countryside. The third movement is, according to Bernstein again, a farewell to city life, or to intellectual hustle and bustle life of Vienna, which Mahler was very much a part of. And then the fourth movement, the Adagio, Bernstein referred to as an actual farewell to life itself. I very much like this definition and this interpretation of the piece, because I agree with it wholeheartedly. I think that it makes sense to look at it that way. But we should get into why that is, and I will speak a little bit about the first movement, which is massive, and actually if Bernstein conducts it, it lasts almost half an hour. Just the first movement, the famous Andante Comodo in D major. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of this movement. Alban Berg, the famous composer of the Second Viennese School, wrote about this movement, quote, "The whole movement is based on a premonition of death which constantly recurs. That is why the tenderest passages are followed by tremendous climaxes, like new eruptions of a volcano," end quote. I think this is I agree with this view of the first movement. As a matter of fact, the way I see it is as a kind of daydream / nightmare, where Mahler is sort of like taking us into this very delicate and subtle and sweet atmosphere, and then sometimes slowly and sometimes gradually he sort of anchors us back down to the harsh reality of what I believe is his ultimate knowledge that he is going to die soon from this heart condition. And every time that he brings us back to this sort of like very dramatic and tragic atmosphere, I think he's bringing us back to maybe some of the hard blows that he suffered during his life. Mahler's life is fraught with tragedy and death. Ever since he was a little child, he's always been very close to death, and that is an inextricable fact that is completely present in all of his music, really. And the Ninth Symphony is definitely not an exception. So I think this movement goes back and forth between that sort of childhood innocence that Bernstein referred to, and this sort of very in-your-face, real encounter with the tragedy and the suffering of life itself, which Mahler was unfortunately very well acquainted with. And again, this knowledge of the fact that he was going to die soon. I think he was well aware of his failing heart, and his daughter's death, I think, is extremely present, obviously, in all of the work that he composed after this tragic event. So again, this is no exception to that. So there are these, sort of crescendi into these tragic realizations, and then back down to this sort of dreamlike, very sweet, atmospheric throughout the work, actually. And this brings us back to the formal analysis of this piece, which is very controversial. Some people call it a sonata form. I think you could map it to a loose sonata form, but you could also analyze it as a rondo or even as a theme and variations. But what is most important to realize is that this work is sort of mapped out with these 9 or 10 climactic events. A very peculiar aspect of this first movement is the very opening. In the first 8 measures or so, Mahler provides us with a sort of a table of contents, if you will, of the material that is going to eventually be the framework and the base for the whole movement. And he bases the whole movement around these sort of what I call melodic cells, or mini motifs that end up being the structure to the entire movement. So the first one of these is the famous irregular heartbeat motif, which again Leonard Bernstein famously named after Mahler's failing heart. It is played by the cello and the horns at the very opening of the movement, and it goes something like. In other words, the way the heart should not beat. And this was an indication, according to Bernstein, of Mahler's failing heart and how he wanted to portray it at the very beginning, sort of showing us that he was already aware of his inevitable demise soon thereafter. Second one is the harp motif, which also is very important and comes back in many different iterations throughout the movement. There is also a sort of fanfare that is played by the horns at the beginning, which also comes back later. Another type of fanfare that comes back is also played in the horns. It's something like. That's another little motivic cell which make up the movement. There is a little viola tremolo that also comes back later. All of this happening in the very opening of the movement, the first few measures. And then obviously the arguably the most important one of these motives is the one stolen from Beethoven's piano sonata, the Das Lebewohl motif, the farewell motif, which is now played in D major, as this is the key of this movement. So now this very simple, two-note motive is later on developed into a more complete melody. But something that is, I think, very important to note is the fact that Mahler is using these much shorter sort of snippets or cells, melodic cells, as a very important element in the structure of the movement. He incorporates them in various different ways and brings them back, again, creating this sort of symmetry with these climaxes that demarcate the structure of the movement. And these melodic cells are what make up the information within these climaxes. So this is sort of like a microscopic view of the movement, and a macroscopic view would be to divide it into these different climactic moments, which is why it's also maybe correct to analyze this movement as a theme and variations, or maybe a rondeau, as well as a loose sonata form. So this is a sort of a view of the opening of the first movement, which again is a kind of table of context for the remainder of the work. Something that is very interesting, at least to me, about this movement is that it is also a farewell to traditional harmony in a way. Now, Mahler sort of had his foot steeped in tradition, and he paid homage, obviously, to the great symphonists of the past, but also he was looking towards the future. And he wasn't the first one, of course, to do these kinds of experiments with harmony, but he was definitely of the first ones. And what I mean by this is that in several sections of this work, there are moments that are sort of stepping into less tonal, not really atonal, but less tonal harmonic language, which at the time was not very common and was considered to be sort of very avant-garde. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. At the first 30 measures of the first movement, measure 39, we have the first of these climaxes that demarcate this movement, and what I call his first encounter with death, or the first, realization of his condition, coming down from this sort of like very ethereal and childlike and beautiful atmosphere to a more real encounter with death. And so we have a very clear D minor chord played by the entire orchestra, basically. And then suddenly we had been in D major, we switched to D minor. So now we're in D minor, and the celli begin playing this line over this D minor chord, which is really spelling out a D flat major chord, and extremely distant. You can't get more distant than this from D minor. So here we have an example of maybe what could be a polychord, so more than one chord, or polytonality, more than one tonality happening simultaneously. We have the very clear D minor, but on top of this, we have this D flat major chord happening at the same time, which gives it a very, very dissonant sound. Now, it's not obviously that apparent, or it's not played like that, but I think that it's definitely, the cello line is definitely enough to say that there is something that is already sort of like flirting with atonality, or with less tonal centric music, which is the music of the past. So the movement continues to go on and on between this sort of like daydream, childlike, innocent and beautiful state and atmosphere into these contrasting sort of, clashes with reality, very harsh and at times violent sections that demarcate the sort of the climaxes of the piece that are really kind of like the pillars of it structurally. And these table of content material that we saw, these different melodic cells come back in very different variations, played by different instruments, played in longer forms and shorter forms, etc., etc. And this is what makes up the first movement. We finally come to the biggest climax of the piece, which Mahler actually wrote. He noted on the score, mit höchster Gewalt, with greatest force. And then after that, he quickly writes that the end of the movement should be like a grave funeral procession. Mahler was very famous for writing a lot of notes and notes on top of the notes and footnotes. He was very clear as to how he wanted his music to be played and performed, and he used sometimes ambiguous or more poetic language, and sometimes very precise language, and this symphony is no exception to that. So here, we come to the conclusion of this movement, which is to be played like a grave funeral procession. Again, the allusion to the fact that he is very well aware of his own death approaching, and again with the theme of death, which is very present in, I would say, all of Mahler's work, but maybe especially in this symphony. So that is a very superficial and sort of quick introduction into this first movement, and obviously my wish is that you become more interested in it, and that you yourself listen to it first of all, and then for those of you who can read music by the score and sort of start to investigate it and come up with other interesting aspects of it. I'm sure there are thousands of things that I didn't talk about that are also very interesting about it. So I would love to hear from you. Also let me know what you think about this sort of superficial analysis of the first movement, and obviously whatever other ideas or comments you might have about this masterpiece. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you become more interested in this masterpiece and go listen to it, and have a great day.